Welcome in. Today, we're going to be doing a deep dive into some uncomfortable truths about how the U.S. sees itself, and importantly, how that self-perception has shaped its actions, especially in Latin America. Our guide for this journey is Jorge Majfud, and his book, The Savage Frontier, which really digs deep into the myths underpinning U.S. history.
And he starts with a chilling connection, the 2019 El Paso massacre.
Yeah.
Mahfoud uses the shooter's manifesto, full of white supremacist ideology, to illustrate how justifications for expansionism haven't really disappeared. They've just gone through, different packaging over the centuries. It's a stark reminder that these beliefs have real consequences.
It's terrifying, right, that these ideologies can fester and then explode into violence. It reminds us that history isn't just dates and names in a textbook. It's living, breathing, and it shapes our present.
Exactly. And Mahfoud argues that it's the carefully crafted myths, even more so than the actual realities, that wield the most power. They're become the stories we tell ourselves about who we are as a nation. And often, they're used to justify actions that, if we really examine them, wouldn't hold up to scrutiny.
Okay, so let's unpack that. What kind of myths are we talking about here?
Mahfoud points to this inherent contradiction, almost like a split personality at the heart of the United States. On one hand, you have the lofty ideals of the Founding Fathers, liberty, equality, the idea that all men are created equal, enshrined in the Declaration of Independence.
Those words are practically etched into the American consciousness.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
But on the other hand, there's this deeply embedded belief in Anglo-Saxon superiority, this idea that white Protestant culture is inherently superior to others, racially, religiously, culturally.
It's like we're trying to reconcile two opposing forces, and this isn't some abstract concept, right? You see this contradiction embodied in figures like Thomas Jefferson himself, a man who championed equality but owned slaves. How do you square that circle?
That's precisely Mahfoud's point. He argues that this need to reconcile those grand ideals of freedom and equality with the often brutal reality of U.S. history fueled a need for a powerful narrative, a narrative strong enough to bridge the gap between the two.
And that's where Manifest Destiny enters the stage.
Exactly. The belief that westward expansion across the North American continent was not only inevitable, but a God-given right. This idea becomes the perfect framework for justifying the taking of land, often through violence, first from Native Americans and then from Mexico.
And it's not a static justification either. Mahfoud points out how the reasons given for taking land from those deemed inferior shifted over time. First, it's about expanding the noble ideals of liberty and democracy. Later, it morphs into combating the threat of communism.
Yet the underlying message remains remarkably consistent. U.S. expansion, no matter the human cost, is always framed as necessary for the greater good, almost as if it's ordained by a higher power.
And it's easy to get caught up in that narrative, to see it as this grand and inevitable march of progress. But what really struck me was this question Mahfoud raises: freedom for whom? Because when you look closer, U.S. history is full of people for whom that promise rang hollow.
Right. Mahfoud challenges us to confront the selective nature of freedom as it's been applied throughout U.S. history. He argues that more often than not, this ideal excluded anyone deemed unworthy by those in power. Native Americans, African Americans, Mexicans, they were systematically denied the very freedoms being touted on a national stage.
So instead of being a beacon of genuine liberation for all, the concept of freedom itself becomes a tool for justifying control and exploitation. It's almost insidious how easily those ideas can be twisted.
And what's even more concerning is that this pattern of justifying questionable actions with noble ideals isn't confined to the history books. It keeps appearing.
You're right. It makes you think about modern events with a whole new perspective. It's like, hold on, are we falling for the same tricks, the same narratives, even today?
It's a question worth asking ourselves. But before we get into modern parallels, let's delve a bit deeper into some specific examples from Mahfoud's book that highlight this pattern, particularly when it comes to U.S. involvement in Latin America.
You mean how what looks like spreading democracy and freedom on the surface is often motivated by something much less noble: economic interests?
Precisely. Take the Banana Wars, for instance. The U.S. intervened militarily not to protect some grand ideal, but to protect the business interests of U.S. fruit companies operating in Latin America.
It's almost like those companies were dictating U.S. foreign policy. And then there's the support for brutal dictatorships, all in the name of fighting communism.
It is a dark irony, isn't it? Propping up regimes that stifle dissent and violate human rights, all while claiming to be spreading democracy. And then there are the covert CIA operations. which Mahfud certainly doesn't shy away from.
Okay. Let's talk about those covert operations, because that's where things get really murky. It's one thing to intervene openly, but the secrecy adds a whole other layer of complexity. What are your thoughts on this?
Those covert operations are a prime example, really, of how the myth of American exceptionalism can be used to justify actions that are, well, anything but exceptional. And Mahfud argues that these actions stem from a specific set of core myths. These myths are so ingrained in the American psyche that they shape not just, U.S. foreign policy, but how the nation sees itself on the world stage.
And he actually names some of these myths directly, doesn't he? I have to admit, reading that part made me squirm a little. It's like he was calling out some deeply held assumptions I didn't even realize I had.
Oh, absolutely. These are beliefs many of us have grown up with, almost like the air we breathe. And Mahfud tackles them head-on. For example, there's the myth that the U.S. has never had a dictatorship.
Which on the surface seems like a straightforward statement, right? But Mahfud pokes some serious holes in that idea.
He certainly does. He points out, the glaring contradiction. A system built on slavery, where large segments of the population were denied basic rights, where the government could seize land from those deemed inferior. How is that not a form of dictatorship, even if it doesn't fit the neat definition we often use?
It's like that saying, history is written by the victors, you know? And in this case, the narrative of American exceptionalism, this idea that the U.S. has always been a force for good in the world, that narrative has been incredibly effective. Makes you wonder how many other stories we've accepted without question just because they were presented by those in power.
That's why it's so important to, critically examine those dominant narratives. Mahfud also dissects the myth that the U.S. has always fought for democracy, particularly in Latin America.
Which clashes pretty hard with the reality on the ground, right?
Exactly. He contrasts this idealized version of history with the fact that the U.S. has a long, well-documented history of supporting right-wing dictatorships, often to protect its own economic interests, even when those regimes were actively suppressing their own people.
It's like this bait and switch, propping up dictatorships in the name of spreading democracy. And that's not the only contradiction Mahfud calls out. He also tackles the idea that American culture is somehow less corrupt than, say, Latin American culture, which is a pretty bold claim to make.
And then he dismantles that claim by highlighting the very real, very pervasive systems of, legalized corruption within the U.S. political system itself. Campaign finance, lobbying, the revolving door between government and corporations, it's all interconnected.
It's like he's saying, let's not pretend there's some higher moral ground here. We have our own demons to wrestle with. And it feels like a lot of these myths revolve around this idea of American innocence, this belief that the U.S. is always coming from a place of good intentions. Mahfud really pushes back on that narrative, especially when he talks about the myth of the heroic American soldiers sacrificing themselves to defend freedom and democracy around the world.
And it's a powerful myth. It taps into this idea of selflessness, of putting oneself in harm's way for a greater cause. But as Mahfud points out, it's not the complete picture. He doesn't dispute the bravery of individual soldiers, of course, but he challenges the framing of these wars and interventions as being, purely defensive or altruistic.
Right. He points to the sheer number of wars the U.S. has initiated, the vast scale of its military spending, the highest in the world by far, and the often devastating consequences of these interventions for the people living in those countries. He's not trying to sugarcoat anything.
Not at all.
Yeah.
And that leads to another really important distinction that Mahfud makes, one that I think is crucial to understanding how the U.S. sees itself and its role in the world, the difference between frontier and border.
I have to admit, I'd never really thought about it that way before, but when he laid it out, it was like a light bulb went off. In English, those words carry such different meanings, and they reveal so much about how the U.S. has interacted with the world.
Exactly. The frontier represents this limitless space, ripe for the taking. It's all about pushing boundaries, taming the wild, claiming what's seen as rightfully yours, even if that means displacing or eliminating those already there.
It's like this constant outward push, driven by that belief in manifest destiny, and anyone who doesn't fit into that us automatically becomes part of the problem, an obstacle to overcome.
Precisely. And that's where the concept of the border comes in. Once the frontier has been conquered, the border is erected to keep others out, to protect what's been acquired.
It creates this us versus them mentality, doesn't it? Like you said, once you've claimed your territory, then you need to protect it from being encroached upon, from being tainted by outside influences.
And that's where things get really Interesting, because Mahfoud connects this idea of the border to like the anxieties at the heart of the American identity. He argues that this fear of the other, this fear of being contaminated or overtaken, is like deeply intertwined with the myth of American exceptionalism.
Because if you truly believe you're the shining city on a hill, the beacon of hope for the world, then you need to protect that city at all costs. Any crack in the facade, any hint that things aren't perfect, threatens to undermine the whole narrative.
Exactly. It's a powerful narrative.
Yeah.
But, as we've been discussing, it comes at a cost. Because when you view the world through that lens, when you buy into your own mythology, it becomes dangerously easy to justify all sorts of actions, no matter how destructive they might be. And it allows you to ignore the very real harm inflicted on others in the name of protecting your own interests.
Which brings us to what I found to be one of the most thought-provoking aspects of Mahfoud's book. His argument that this particular combination of God, race, and guns has profoundly shaped not only U.S. actions, but also its self-perception, often to the detriment of others.
It's a potent trifecta, isn't it? This belief in a divine right to expand, the idea of inherent racial superiority, and the unwavering faith in military power as the ultimate solution. These elements have been there from the very beginning of, the American experiment.
And they continue to echo through the present, don't they? Even when they're not explicitly stated, you see them playing out in the rhetoric around immigration, in the debates about foreign intervention, even in the way history is taught in schools.
It's like we've all been conditioned, to some extent, to view the world through this very particular lens. And what Mahfoud does so effectively is hold up a mirror to that conditioning. He's not offering like easy answers or trying to simplify complex historical events. He's asking us to confront some uncomfortable truths, to acknowledge the gap between the myths we tell ourselves about our history and the realities experienced by so many others as a result of those myths.
And he doesn't let anyone off the hook either. He even critiques those within Latin America who've bought into these narratives, who've justified U.S. interventions or downplay the harm they've caused. It's a call for accountability on all sides.
Yeah, he's advocating for a more nuanced, more honest understanding of history. One that acknowledges the good and the bad, the triumphs and the tragedies. Because only then, he argues, can we truly learn from the past and chart a different course for the future.
It's a call to action for all of us, isn't it? To question the narratives we've been taught, to seek out multiple perspectives, to be wary of simplistic explanations, and to challenge injustice wherever we see it, even when it's uncomfortable or challenges our own deeply held beliefs.
Absolutely. And that's something we can all do, regardless of our nationality or background. It's about recognizing the power of myths, the seductive way they can be used to justify the unjustifiable.
And it's about recognizing our own potential complicity in perpetuating those myths, even unintentionally. It's about being willing to look in the mirror and ask ourselves some tough questions. What stories have I accepted as truth without questioning them? Where do my blind spots lie? And most importantly, what can I do to challenge those harmful narratives and create a more just and equitable world?
Those are the questions that will lead to real change.
That's a powerful note to end on. If myths are so potent that they can shape actions, influence policies, and even justify brutal realities, as Mahfoud argues, then we have a responsibility to constantly unearth and challenge them, not just in history books, but in our own lives, in our communities, and in the world around us. So I'll leave you with this. What myths are you carrying with you? And what will you do to challenge them? Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Catch you next time.
Don't